Hello, this is Ken Crystal, Associate Professor of Law at the Widener University School of Law. And welcome to this video on podcasting in law school. This is the first of a multi-part set of videos. And in this part one, I want to talk to you about what podcasting is and why I do it and why I believe it can be effective for teaching law students. First, we should define our terms. What is podcasting? And what are podcasts? Some people believe that the term podcast is really the joining together of the words iPod and broadcasting, because many of the early podcasts, in fact, were played on iPods. But I think that a better definition is to think of a podcast as simply a short recording that is available for review on a listener's own time. If you go around the web, you can find many different kinds of podcasts on a variety of topics. Indeed, this recording that you're listening to is a podcast because it's something that you've chosen to listen to on your own time. And so podcasts can be video or they can be audio recordings. Just depends on the technology used and what the person creating the podcast wants to achieve. So if podcasts are these short recordings, then podcasting is simply recording and making available podcasts to students who are going to listen to them. I have been a user of podcasts for over 5 years now. I've used them primarily in connection with my first year property classes that I teach. Over that 5-year period, I've used podcasting in many different ways. The most common way is that I create topical summaries of property concepts for my students to review. So in Property 1, I have podcasts on things like bailments, found property, the many different types of issues arising in possessory estates, or landlord-tenant, or takings. In Property 2, I have podcasts on the different kinds of easements, issues about deeds and mortgages, etc. Each of these recordings is about 5 to 12 minutes long and consists primarily of me talking about the key concepts I want a student to know about that particular issue. So, the bailment podcast, for example, starts out by saying there are 4 elements to a prima facie case of bailment. And I talk about what those elements are, and then use the cases and the notes in the casebook to provide examples that help to explain what the different elements mean. And occasionally, I will also offer new examples or new ideas so that the students can help to understand what the concept means. Topical summaries are what I've been doing for the last 5 years in over 10 semesters now of Property 2. But in the last year or so, I've done some additional and different versions of podcasts. As part of a pilot program at the law school, I put together a series of videos on 5 different topics for first year, first semester students. Topics like classroom participation, case reading, outlining, legal analysis, and final exams. The idea was that students might not understand why we do what we do. And so a purpose of the video is first to explain that. Why do we do the Socratic method? Why do we read cases? So that they can have a better understanding of why they're doing what they do. And then also to offer tips as to how they can do it better and benefit from it in terms of their own education. These 5 different topics were really about 30 minutes of video. And I had to break them up actually into 2 15-minute pieces because YouTube has limits on how big of a video you can post. So yes, these are on YouTube. You can go to YouTube and find the Ken Crystal channel and actually be able to view these videos. But expanded talks are another way. One of the most difficult topics in property are possessory estates and future interests. And while I have topical summary podcasts on all the basic components, I've decided that recording the entire class in which we talk about various issues might be helpful to students who want to go back and listen again to what was said in class. And so I've made entire recordings of the class on the different possessory estate and future interest issues available to students as a podcast. And finally, I've started giving graded quizzes on the theory that that's a good assessment tool not only for me but also for the students. But giving a quiz in class and then having to explain the answer takes up a lot of class time. And so what I've done is I've moved the explanation and analysis of the quiz into a podcast that a student can listen to at his or her own time. In it, I talk about the problem and I explain why each of the potential answers was right or wrong, so that they can see the actual thought process that leads to the correct answer. So these are different ways that I've used them, and I suspect that I will continue to invent other ways to use podcasts. All right, why podcasting? How can it help educate law students? To understand this, I think we first have to look at the problem of educating students in the typical law school classroom. I mean, obviously it's not an insurmountable problem. Many students go through law school and they learn to become competent lawyers as a result of our instruction. But there are also many students who struggle, and part of the problem may be that the typical classroom makes it difficult for them to be able to learn. There are 2 problems that I see in the classroom concept itself. The first is a problem of time constraints. We have pressure for coverage, and that pressure to cover many different topics tends to limit the amount of time we can spend on any individual topic. Second, we expect students to come to class prepared and participate in class and to get it. But a lot of times we can look out and see that the majority of students have in fact gotten it, but there are some that have not. And so there's also a time pressure created by the majority. Do we take the time to instruct further to get those last few stragglers and risk having the entire class tune out and get bored? Or do we move on because the majority have it and either leave those other students to come ask us questions afterwards or find some other way to learn it? So there's a problem of time constraints built into the classroom experience. There's also a problem of what I call the echo effect. You know, students may get some information in class or write things down in their notes, but in order to fully comprehend it, they have to grasp it at a deeper level. And sometimes, unless students come to the professor and ask questions, they are going to turn to outside sources, commercial outlines, horn books, or even their own classmates to try to figure out what it was they were supposed to learn. And the problem, of course, is that when you get away from the professor to these outside sources, you have the risk that the information they're learning from those outside sources isn't the same thing. It's more like an echo. It might be close, but it's not exact. And the problem, of course, is compounded if what they're doing is talking to their fellow students. Because, like any game of telephone, you can eventually get to a point where maybe the information they think they're getting is incomplete, or worse, inaccurate. So, there's a problem of the echo effect for those who aren't getting it right away in the classroom. There are also some problems created by the learning process itself that educational learning theory tells us. Cognitivist learning theory basically describes learning as a process which starts with sensory inputs, the visual input of seeing something on the page as you read it, or up on the board as it's written, or hearing information, and then taking the relevant sensory inputs and putting them in the short-term working memory where they can be organized and then with that organization moved into long-term memory so that they can be recalled. And that organizational process relies on what the theories sometimes call schema, that are principles of organization that allows the student to be able to take the information, sort it out into the right pigeonholes or schema, and then be able to move it in the long-term memory. Now this process, recognized by the cognitivist learning theory, suggests that there are three impediments that may exist in the learning process. The first impediment is simply one of timing. You know, the student who misses the sensory input because they're distracted, because they're daydreaming, whatever it might be, if they miss the sensory input, they don't have anything to move into short-term and then long-term memory. It becomes a problem if they don't grasp it at the time that it's available to the senses for grasping. The second impediment that this learning theory suggests is what is sometimes called cognitive load. If we imagine information as moving as a kind of flow that moves from the sensory to the short-term working memory, gets organized and moved into the long-term memory, then there is a flow of information that's happening. During the classroom, there's information constantly coming at the student. And so the student has to be able to take that information and have it flow smoothly through the process. How much information is there and how quickly it moves is that idea that there is a load on the cognitive process. And when a student is struggling to be able to move the information efficiently through short-term working memory and into long-term memory, then you can have a high cognitive load. And at some point the information, in a sense, backs up. And it can't get there anymore because information is being lost as the information is being, that is being worked on gets processed. What makes this even more important and more obvious is the fact that the key to organizing the information so it can move in the long-term memory are these schema. And especially for first-year students, they don't always have the schema that allows them to efficiently move the information from working memory into long-term memory. What is a tort? What are plaintiffs? What are defendants? Are things that first-year students have to learn how to process, as well as the actual information about the case or the rule of law that's being discussed in the class. So the lack of schema tends to slow down the process and thereby increase cognitive load, which then risks students losing that information and not getting it to long-term memory where it needs to go. How can podcasting help solve that problem? Well, as a short recording that is available for a student to work with on their own time. Podcasting, in effect, allows repetitive listening, which, first of all, can remove those time pressures. The student doesn't have to grasp the sensory input at the one time it's out there, but instead can listen to a podcast again and again and get the information to be able to work with it into short-term memory. So it removes time pressure because there is the ability to listen to it multiple times. Secondly, because of that ability to listen repetitively or to hit the pause button, podcasting allows the student to manage cognitive load, to slow the process down so that the information doesn't back up, that it can be organized at the pace the student works at. And thereby, you don't run the risk of a high cognitive load preventing learning from happening. And precisely because of that slowing down, it allows the student to develop the necessary schema to organize the information and then process it. So, podcasting, by putting control of the process in the student's hands, increases the possibility that the student can facilitate the flow of information through the working memory into the long-term memory by appropriately creating and utilizing the schema necessary for true learning. But the benefits of podcasting are not just limited to what the student gets. There are professorial benefits as well. First, podcasting allows the professor to control the content. Students will hear a concept described exactly the way the professor wants it described. They don't have to turn to their fellow students or turn to some other source. They don't have to listen to the echoes because they're hearing it straight from the professor. So, control of content is certainly one benefit. A second benefit is that it allows multiple opportunities to reach and teach the students. You don't have just the 55 minutes or hour and 15 minutes in the classroom. You have multiple opportunities because the student can listen multiple times. And so, more chances for the student to get the concept because they can listen to the podcast again and again. And thirdly, because the students can listen on their own time, you expand the learning space beyond the classroom. I take a survey of my students, and one of the questions that I ask them is, where do you listen to podcasts? And it's amazing all the different places they do. They listen to podcasts while they're driving to and from school. They listen while they're working out or doing housework or walking the dog. So, because they can listen on their own time, now the learning space becomes wherever their recorder is and they want to listen and learn. So it expands the learning space. All right, does podcasting work? Well, one of the ways we can measure that is to ask the students, do they think it works? And every time that I've done podcasts, in the 10 semesters so far, I always have a poll where I ask students the same certain questions about their podcast usage and their opinions of it. And because I've done it over 10 plus semesters, I have nearly 500 responses. So I have a large database to draw from. What those surveys show is that 82% of students have used the podcast. And what's interesting is that because I take the survey usually in the beginning of November in the fall semester, this is before the crush of finals. So during the semester, 82% of the students have already used the podcasts. And of them, 67% are listening to them 2 or more times, which means that for that group, I am reaching them at least 3 times, once in the classroom and twice in the podcast. So, multiple opportunities to reach and teach, and students are taking advantage of that. Now, that suggests that students must think these podcasts are worthwhile. Why would they listen to them a second time if they didn't? And in fact, the survey shows that 87% of students give podcasts a rating of 4 or 5 on a scale of 0 to 5, where 5 is the highest possible score. So, multiple listenings and high ratings suggest that students really think these are good. And when asked if they would use them in the rest of the semester, 99% of students say that they intend to use them during the remainder of the semester. So students think that this is good. And on a qualitative basis, I can tell you that every semester I get numerous students who come to me and thank me for doing podcasts because they say it helped them learn the concepts. So the students really believe that they work. And I believe that they do as well. All right, that's why podcasting. In part 2, the second of these, I'm going to talk about issues concerning how to make podcasts. What's the strategy and what are the technical possibilities related to that? So I hope that you will listen to part 2 and learn more, because hopefully part 1 has convinced you that podcasting is worth a try. Finally, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I would be happy to try to answer them as best I can.